lot of people like to ask this question about why the Roman Empire fell. And, you know, it's sort of like, why did the Beatles break up? I feel like these two questions are like two of the most popular historical questions that you find people asking. You know, it's like, I don't even really know why. I don't know why people feel the need to answer that question so much. I mean, sure, I guess it's a question that deserves an answer, but I don't know. To me, what's special about the Roman Empire versus any other kingdom or sovereignty? Why is the Roman Empire specifically the one where people want to know why it fell? I don't know. But my thing has kind of been like, I'm not even really sure that we can say that the Roman Empire actually did fall. I know that sounds weird, but just the more I've thought about it, the more the idea of the Roman Empire as something that existed and then fell just kind of starts getting like harder to believe in the more sort of perspective you take in on it. Here's what I mean. Okay, so I mean, it starts with the most basic thing, which is that there's this idea that the Roman Empire fell in the 5th century, specifically the year 476, when Odovaker declared himself the King of Italy, thus inventing the idea of a Kingdom of Italy, which had never existed up to that point. That is so often called the fall of the Roman Empire, but of course anyone who actually understands Roman history knows that that was not the fall of the Roman Empire, because Rome had 2 emperors at the time. The other one, of course, was living in Constantinople, and that's why, I mean, everyone kind of, I think, understands this who has studied medieval history or whatever, the late antiquity, that the Roman Empire sort of starts to take on this different name in the history books, called the Byzantine Empire. And I think there's this interesting sort of psychological phenomenon where because the Roman Empire no longer includes Rome, people have a hard time calling it the Roman Empire now. But it still exists. It's still the exact same empire. There's no difference. It just happens to not have Rome anymore. So the position of this city clearly is important for our naming scheme, I guess. That city was the capital, and not just the capital, but just kind of like the whole genesis of this whole institution, and it sort of defined the institution, although it's complicated even further when you realize that Rome wasn't even the capital in reality for a lot of that period. I mean, I guess it was still technically officially the capital, but the emperor lived in Ravenna, so it was still the Roman Empire because it was from Rome, but the emperor lived in Ravenna instead of Rome. So at that point, I don't know how necessary it is for Rome to even be in the empire to call it the Roman Empire. If it's the Empire of Rome, it came out of Rome. It doesn't really matter where the emperor lives or where the capital is or if Rome is even there. So it's kind of a weird sort of distinction that at a certain point we stop calling it the Roman Empire and start calling it the Byzantine Empire. Because they're not two different things, it's the same thing. And of course the Byzantine Empire didn't completely fall until 1453. So it was almost 1,000 years after the so-called fall of the Roman Empire that a lot of people talk about when the Roman Empire actually fell. But the thing is that I'm not even entirely sure you can really say that the Roman Empire fell in 1453, because the last emperor in Constantinople was Constantine the 11th. But he was not the only emperor at that time. But there's this weird sort of continuity problem, because for much of Roman history, there was not just one emperor. There were multiple emperors who all ruled over one empire. And so the idea of there needing to be only one emperor wasn't true even back in antiquity. So the problem comes about really through the church. The church is kind of the thing that creates this weird sort of state where you have two different empires, because originally there were four bishops in the empire, in Christendom, who had the most power and influence and prestige in Christendom. There was the bishop in Rome, the bishop in Constantinople, the bishop in Antioch, and the bishop in Jerusalem. But then what happens is when the Muslims take Jerusalem and Antioch, they're really just left with two. The bishop in Constantinople is called a patriarch, and that's the same thing that the bishop in Rome is called, basically, but he has this sort of nickname of the Pope, which really is a word that comes out of Papa, or Father, Patriarch. But there's this rift that starts to form between the bishops who are loyal to Rome and the bishops who are loyal to Constantinople. For a bunch of reasons, the Roman church uses Latin for their work, whereas the Constantinople church uses Greek. So that was a big difference, and with a difference in language, you get difference in customs and rites, which also creates differences in doctrine that start splitting the two halves of the church. And there's this kind of political weirdness about it, because the bishop in Rome had this idea in his head that he was like the most important thing in the world, that he was the head of the church, and that office was bestowed on him through a long line of succession going back to Saint Peter, who supposedly was like officially designated by Jesus to be the head of the church. And so he has this idea that only the bishop in Rome can be the head of the church. But the problem is that the bishop in Constantinople recognizes the emperor as the head of the church. So there's this disconnect between the opinion of the bishops in Rome and Constantinople as to who is really the head of the church. So the Pope in Rome maintains this sort of need to dominate affairs in the church, and he doesn't allow the sovereigns to exercise sovereignty over the church because he thinks that that's his job, which leads to problems relating to investiture and so on. And he has this kind of authoritarian sort of competitive mindset where he's always sort of competing against the princes to try to assert his authority and the authority of the church over the sovereigns in a way that you don't really have in the East. But one thing that the East has is this sort of continuity and legitimacy regarding the idea of the empire and emperor, which is kind of lacking in the West. The idea of the empire was still strong in Europe, even though the empire was no longer really much of a part of Europe anymore. It had Greece, and that was about it. So what the Pope, I guess, really wants is his own emperor, so that he can have this sort of thing that right now only the Patriarch in Constantinople can claim. And so when there's this succession dispute in the empire, where now there's an empress acting as a sovereign. There's never been a sovereign empress before, and so people don't really agree on whether she actually counts as an emperor or not, whether she actually can be an emperor. And so the Pope uses that as an opportunity to claim that the King of France is now the new emperor, because there is no emperor in the East, and so now the actual emperor is in the West, and he is a Roman Christian. And so he gets the King of France to come to Rome to be crowned emperor, and this is politically useful for him because it allows him to basically sanction the King of France to get rid of the Lombard kingdom, or to rather conquer the Lombard kingdom and become king of the Lombards. Because the thing about the Lombards is that they actually were heretics. They probably believed in the Arian heresy, which was actually like a really old thing that was denounced like back when the empire was like actually in antiquity, the old empire, under Constantine the Great. And so they were kind of enemies of the Bishop of Rome. So getting the King of France to become the new emperor and the new king of the Lombards gave the Pope additional security. But then there was this idea that the Pope would not be subservient to the emperor the way that the Patriarch in Constantinople was. So the Pope would still be head of the church. The emperor would not be head of the church. And yet, for some reason, this idea of emperor as like this protector of the faith figure somehow still mattered to Christendom, to Roman Christendom, for some reason. But the problem that results with this is that now you have two different empires.
Actually, you can draw some parallels between the idea of emperor in Christendom and the idea of caliph in Islam, and the idea of the caliphate, how that evolved. It's not a one-to-one comparison, but there is definitely kind of a similarity in the way this idea sort of abstracted and evolved over time.
So the thing about the old system was, even though there were multiple emperors, it was still technically one empire. Even though they would sometimes fight each other, they still considered their empire to be one effective state. But the problem with this new situation is now the King of France is claiming to be the emperor, but there already is an emperor in Constantinople, and after Irene, there's another male emperor. So it's not like King Charles, Emperor Charles now, it's not like he just like assumed this vacant role that nobody held. It was like he's now this sort of he has this sort of faulty claim on being this thing that he isn't, but because the Pope has given him this designation, it has this sort of legitimacy, but only in the Latin church, the Latin side of the church, not in the Greek side of the church. And so really, I mean, the whole idea of the Roman Empire at this point is really just more about the church than about politics. It's like this religious political thing at this point, instead of being like the church just happens to exist within the framework of the empire. It's almost like the empire now exists within the framework of the church, at least in the West, but in the East it's not like that. And so, like, technically, yeah, this is just a totally new empire that was created by the Pope and the King of France in 800. But at the same time, the way that they were pitching it, they were trying to make it seem like that's not what it was, that it was actually more like the empire is just being occupied in a different place by a different person. And so there's this kind of debate in my mind about whether you can even say that this new empire, which would later become the German Empire, or the Holy Roman Empire, like, how much can you say that this is actually the empire? Because it's clearly a different political entity from the empire that exists in the East. And yet there's this sense that what they really did was just bring back the empire in the West that had been lost. It's almost like the whole thing where when the French Republican government came back after World War II, they weren't the Fourth Republic, they were still the Third Republic, because I guess they still had the same constitution that they had before. But more than that, there's this idea that the government of France didn't actually stop existing during the time of World War II. It's like they just moved to a different place and became sort of the guys who were the legitimate government, but they did not have actual power over the country anymore, and then they just came back. But do you consider that a new republic, or do you just consider it the same republic as before? It's kind of a semantical distinction there. So from one semantical viewpoint, you could see this new empire in the West, this Latin Christian empire, as being just a revival in the West of the old Roman Empire, even though it's like nothing like the old Roman Empire at all. But the idea of emperor is what matters here, and that's kind of the only thing that matters. The idea of emperor and his relationship to the Pope and the Church. Meanwhile, in 1453, okay, the Byzantine Empire, which is the Roman Empire, finally falls, and it's just the city by that point, and it's taken by the Sultan of Rome. Yeah, the Sultan of Rome, also called the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire was this one dynasty. It was only one dynasty, and it was just a bunch of Turkish-speaking sultans who were all descended from a guy named Osman. But because the territory that they lived in was the territory of the Roman Empire, they considered themselves the new Roman emperors, and they considered their territory to be Rome, and they considered themselves to be Romans, even though they spoke Turkish instead of not Latin, but Greek. Yeah, and that's the thing, is that the Roman Empire by this point no longer spoke Latin, which was the native language of the Roman Empire. They spoke Greek. And so from an ethnic standpoint, it's weird to think of the East as the Roman Empire, because it was like totally different, and yet it is the Roman Empire. There is no political distinction there. It's literally the same empire. And so with that in mind, it's very easy to imagine that maybe the Ottoman Empire is just the Roman Empire under new management, with a different stock of, sovereigns ruling over it. It's really not that difficult to wrap your head around that idea, if you can wrap your head around the idea of a once Latin empire now being Greek. But that also kind of lends this legitimacy to the Latin Church now having the legitimate empire, because at least they're speaking Latin in their liturgy. And so, is the Ottoman Empire now the new Roman Empire? There's another emperor who kind of comes about around this time, a little bit after, I think. I believe the first emperor of Russia was Ivan the Terrible. Now, I don't know much about Russian history, but one thing I have heard is that after the fall of Constantinople, when a bunch of these sort of church leaders had to find a new place to live, had to find a new place for their church, for this Greek Orthodox church, they went to Russia. And so that gave the Russians this idea that Russia is now the new Roman Empire in a way. And this is another example of the idea of empire being so firmly connected with the church in this strange way, which is funny when you think about it, because the Roman Empire, when it was created, it wasn't even Christian. And in fact, Christianity wasn't even a thing yet. And so this institution that started before Christianity even existed, now for some reason is tied into Christianity so much that it's almost like Christianity determines how you understand this idea of emperor and empire. But then in 1806, the German emperor, who is the Latin Christian emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, by this point, he's from the Habsburg family, living in Austria, which is his actual, like, his family domain is Austria. But then there's all these other principalities and sovereignties that exist within his empire. So that's kind of weird. But in 1806, he decides to actually formally end the empire. And so you'd think that this would be kind of the official, like, if there was any end of the Roman Empire, it's here. But the weird thing is that he doesn't stop being the emperor. He only stops being the Holy Roman Emperor, but now he's still the emperor. He's just the emperor of Austria, when he used to just be the king of Austria. Now Austria is considered an empire, which it never was before. But what does this mean? Is Austria the new empire, or is it just a new empire? It is the same emperor from the old empire, but it's a different empire. But then it gets even more complicated, because in 1871, the King of Prussia becomes an emperor. And so the territories that used to be in the Holy Roman Empire before it was dissolved in 1806 now are an empire again, and it's called the German Empire. And this can sort of be seen as a revival of the Holy Roman Empire, because it's the same place, it's the same country. It's just that now they're not calling it the Holy Roman Empire anymore, and it doesn't have that Catholic connection that it used to. Now it has this sort of German nationalist sort of identity. But in a weird, strange, distant way, you can almost say that the German emperor does have a kind of weird, wishy-washy claim on being the Roman emperor. And so you have a situation where you have 4 of these emperors. I don't know, I think the Sultan in Constantinople is considered an emperor. I'm not sure about that, though. But you have these 4 emperors, and all 4 of them come crashing down because of World War I. So the 2 Kaisers and the Czar and the Sultan are just all... they're no longer a thing. And so at that point, World War I is really the final place where you can just say, okay, you can't even really make any argument anymore that the Roman Empire is still a thing, because every empire that had even the slightest sort of wishy-washy, watery claim on being Rome is gone. And so there's a way of thinking about it that says, yes, obviously the Roman Empire fell in 1453. But if you think about it in different ways, it might not have actually, the Roman Empire might not have actually fallen per se. It's more like it gradually abstracted itself out of existence. It started out as this thing that was real and had a meaning and an identity as an institution. But then it gradually just became this idea floating out here somewhere in the ether that may or may not be these different things. So, in a way, you can almost think of it as the Roman Empire didn't fall until World War I. Even though, obviously, it fell in 1453. But did it? Or did it just gradually abstract out of existence? Was 1453 only one event, major event, in a long sort of series of events that sort of grew out of each other and made the idea of empire and emperor lose its meaning gradually over time? It's an interesting idea. But that's VEDN Day 5. See you tomorrow for VEDN Day 6.